Welcome everyone. So today's iteration of the Rockefeller College election series is going to look at critical perspectives on AI, the relationship between AI and politics, AI and government, AI and society. So with us today, we're joined by three faculty members here at Rockefeller College. We're joined by Dr. Virginia Eubanks. Dr. Eubanks's work examines how algorithms often reinforce existing inequality in society. Many of you might be familiar with her work, Automating Inequality. We are also joined by Dr. Stefan Kehlenbach. Dr. Kehlenbach's research looks at ways and tries to rethink ways in which AI atomizes individuals in society through what he calls the subatomic individual. And finally, we're joined by Dr. Kayla Schwoerer. Her research is on digital citizen-to-state interaction, emphasizing user experience. She tends to emphasize algorithmic transparency, explainability, and accountability in her work. So before I pass it over, I think we're going to start with Dr. Eubanks here. Before I pass it over to her, just laying out some ground rules here. Same ground rules as always. If you have any questions over the course of any of our panelists' talks here, just put them in the chat and I will read them to the panelists once we move on to the Q&A section. Alternatively, as always, you can use the hand raise function too. I'll also be looking at that. So yeah, with that being said, I'll pass it over to Dr. Eubanks.
Thank you so much, Connor. And I want to thank Renee Wallingford for all her hard work getting us all together in this sort of Brady Bunch set of digital squares on your screens. There's a lot of invisible work that goes into making these things happen, and I just want to acknowledge that and say thank you. I'm really excited to be here. As Connor said, my name is Virginia Eubanks. I'm an associate professor here in political science at Rockefeller College, and my work has to do with technology and inequality, public services, and care and caregiving. So the work that Connor mentioned, this book, Automating Inequality, How High-Tech Tools Profile, Police, and Punish the Poor, it's probably my most well-known book. It came out in 2018. And in it, I tell three stories about automated decision-making in public services in the United States. So I talk about an automated eligibility system in the state of Indiana that denied more than 1 million public assistance applications in the 3 years of the experiment, which is more than a 50% increase from the 3 years before the experiment. I tell the story of a system in Los Angeles called the Coordinated Entry System, which proponents call the Match.com of homeless services. The intention of that tool is to match the most vulnerable unhoused people with the most appropriate available housing, and it responds to the really catastrophic housing crisis in Los Angeles County. There's more than 75,000 people unhoused currently this year in Los Angeles County. And then I look, the third case I look at in the book is a tool called the Allegheny Family Screening Tool in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, which is where Pittsburgh is. And this is a tool that's supposed to be able to predict which children might be victims of abuse or neglect in the future. So just very quickly, I want to give you sort of the big take-home lessons from that book, and then I'll move on to talking about some more recent stuff and some more big picture sort of ideas. So the sort of the take-home points from automating inequality first, or the lessons from each story, really are in Indiana, that though effective and well-designed automated decision-making systems can lower administrative burdens and actually increase access to programs, they can also be used to cull the roles, to shift the labor of casework from public workers to recipients themselves. And also they're often built in this framework of scarcity, this idea that we have to do digital triage because there simply are not enough resources for everybody to attain their basic human rights. That was certainly the case in Los Angeles, where we saw the coordinated entry system really acting as a kind of empathy override in an incredibly overwhelming tragic situation. So what we saw in Los Angeles was that the coordinated entry system ranked unhoused people on the scale of vulnerability, which really became understood as a spectrum of deservingness. It was doing a kind of algebra of deservingness. And that it also opened people up to increased criminal justice scrutiny and police surveillance. And finally, in the Allegheny Family Screening Tool, we really saw that that tool created what I call in the book feedback loops of injustice, where because the county only had access to data from people who were accessing public services, the tool then ranked people accessing public services as more risky to their children. And that the tool itself didn't, despite promises to mitigate caseworker discretion and remove bias from the system, it didn't remove bias, it just moved whose bias was being included in the tool. So rather than the discretion in this case being held by frontline call center workers, the discretion in this case was held by the computer programmers and the administrators who designed the tool, which often hid their biases in a way that I believe make them harder to address. So since Automating Inequality came out, I've been working with my really incredible colleague, Andrea Quijada in New Mexico, to collect oral histories from the point of view of people around the world who have experienced this transition to digital public services, particularly in COVID. So we've collected narratives, or we've gathered narratives from 10 countries around the world: the United States, the United Kingdom, Finland, Spain, Colombia, Indonesia, Uganda, Kenya, Australia, and Aotearoa, New Zealand. And probably like the biggest take-home lesson from this work so far is what we're seeing is that statistical tools like automated decision-making or algorithmic policy-making or artificial intelligence, by their very nature, work best for people who are in the middle of the normal curve, in the middle of the bell curve. Which what we saw, the impacts of that we saw in the global work was that people who were already pretty well off as systems digitized and modernized during COVID may in fact do a little bit better, but outliers, the folks who are sort of on the edges for whatever reason, they were living in complicated households, they had multiple intersecting needs, they faced sort of language issues, they had disabilities of different kinds. Those folks do much, much worse inside these systems. And in political science, we would call that a tyranny of the majority. So that is something that I'm thinking a lot about these days, which is about how these statistical tools, because they are based in predictions coming from historical data, how they reproduce these sort of overriding of basic rights of minorities in the United States, and elsewhere. And I'll just tell one story, which I spoke at length to an administrator of public service programs in Finland, who had started out as somebody who was very, very in favor of automating public services because they wanted to lower the barriers to accessing money, particularly as low as they could for the people of Finland. But 3 years into an experiment to modernize all of the last chance social services in Finland, she told me that she realized they had made a huge mistake, which was, she said, that they had forgotten who we should be designing public services for. In Finland, the history is that the systems are designed to serve the people who have the most needs first. And she really felt like the automation of their systems had broken that basic cultural value in Finland. And so I'm going to leave it there because I'm really excited to hear what Stefan and Kayla have to say, and I'm excited to get to our conversation. Thank you so much for being here, and thanks for giving me some time to talk about my work.
We can hand it off to Stefan now. Thank you so much, Dr. Eubanks, for getting the ball rolling here. Yeah.
Yeah, hello, I'm Stefan Kehlenbach. I'm an assistant professor in political science here at the Rockefeller College. I want to echo what Virginia said about thanking everybody who worked to put this together. We were maybe not the easiest group to schedule and work with. So with all of us doing various things at this current moment. So I appreciate all the work and appreciate everybody showing up. So I think I'm going to say a couple of quick things about what I do in my own research, and I'm always happy to talk about that. And then I have a couple of sort of prepared things I put together about AI and the election and the way that these things are to sort of maybe keep on, or at least attempt to keep on theme, although that's not always my strong suit. So what I do, and I'd say like what my current book project is working on is I'm working on developing a political theory of data and datification. And so the ways in which people are sort of turned into data, the way that data collection operates and how it sort of exists in our political and social environments. I'm attempting to do this through sort of grappling with all of the different elements of the ways in which our lives are impacted by data, from the sort of material and immaterial elements of data, looking at data centers and thinking through those sorts of questions, while also thinking through the sort of subjectivities of data, the way it might impact the way that we view the world, how the way that we are sort of perceived by institutions and power structures. Connor talked about this a little bit, thinking about the ways that individuals are changed and sort of reduced down to component parts through the collections of data. So that's sort of my main project now. I also have other projects I'm working on dealing with questions of data literacy or data as property ownership and the ways that data impacts what we think of as real or acceptable knowledge. So those are all sort of additional things that are in that broad umbrella of thinking about data and thinking about a political theory of data. But to sort of get on theme with AI and the election, I think when I was sort of putting together some things to think about for this little gathering that we have here, I was sort of thinking about the ways in which AI is working in this national election in two sort of ways. And one of the interesting things that sort of came up is how, I don't know, maybe some of the other panelists will chime in on this, but how little impact AI seems to be having on this national, at least national level election. I mean, and I think in a way that is to be expected, like political campaigns are risk averse and AI is rather new and the impacts of AI are untested. So a campaign isn't going to spend a lot of money doing something that they aren't sure is going to get them votes. I think one of the big worries that was coming into this election that I think we haven't seen was a proliferation of like deep fakes or other sort of AI generated specific misinformation. I think what has actually happened is a little more interesting. We're seeing AI generated imagery, generative AI material operating a little bit more like a political caricature, something maybe a little closer to a political cartoon, where they are descriptions of worldviews rather than, say, real attempts at misinformation. The only really counter point to that is when Trump posted on Truth Social about Taylor Swift endorsing him or being in favor of him, which sort of prompted Taylor Swift herself to come out and endorse Harris. And so that's been the main thing I think that's happened. But other than that, we haven't seen too much uses of generative AI to do disinformation work or deep fakes or voice faking. There was the one instance of Biden in doing fake robocalls in North Carolina, but that got, or in New Hampshire, excuse me, but that got tamped down pretty quickly. We could also be seeing something like AI used in polling analysis or data analytics. I'd be a little hesitant to call that AI in the way that we think of it versus something like machine learning or other sorts of sort of data analytic capabilities. But it's hard to tell. Campaigns will tend to be pretty close-lipped about these sorts of things and not really like to give out the secret sauce of their campaigns. I know there are some consultant startups that tend to advertise AI, but that tends to be more about sort of marketing and pushing an idea of what AI could be rather than any sort of real hard-nosed like discussion of material things. I think what is more interesting is how discussion and hype comes out in policy positions. And I think this might be something that Dr. Schwoerer might have more to say about too. But I think there's an interesting how this discussion and hype of AI comes out in policies. Harris, for example, in her acceptance speeches and on her website, talks about advancing AI, but in a sort of broad framework that mostly has to do with questions of innovation, of like, we're going to innovate and do new technologies, and that will include AI, without much sort of direct discussion of what that's going to be. The more interesting thing with Harris is that as part of the Biden administration, there have been lots of moves around trying to regulate or manage AI. And that's mostly been driven by Lina Khan at the FTC, who's been sort of pushing for a lot of these regulatory oversights. We got the executive order and some other things like that. But we also see that some of Harris's larger donor class don't want her to reappoint Khan and might be trying to sideline her. There was the co-founder of LinkedIn who donates a lot to the Harris campaign and sort of said this in the New York Times. And so I think that'll be a signal about what Harris's position on AI and regulation will be sort of focused around this reappointment or not of Lina Khan. The Trump campaign has been a little bit trickier. Until very recently, they haven't really talked about AI all that much. There's been some odd hints about some things in particularly JD Vance's debate performance. He tends to signal to some of the larger tech companies in his rhetoric. He comes from that area. He's well funded, and like his funding ties to people like Peter Thiel are well documented. And so he tends to say things that sort of trigger or indicate his support for those sort of positions. Like in the debate, he talked about the desire to build more nuclear reactors, and that's sort of something that large tech companies have been wanting to do recently. Like Microsoft just purchased a reactor at 3 Mile Island to try to start up for the exclusive use of data centers. So the Trump campaign has sort of been signaling to tech companies that they are more in favor of deregulation. And that was sort of mirrored when a couple, like this week, I believe, the Trump campaign put out a statement about how we should be completely deregulating AI and sort of pushing it as a complete counter to any sort of regulation. And you can only sort of imagine that that comes from this connection that campaign has with some of the larger tech companies. So I can leave it there and hand it over to Dr. Schwoerer, and yeah, happy to talk about that or more of my research later. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Just a fair warning, I have a cat that's out and about here who wants to eagerly join the conversation despite wanting nothing to do with me for most of today. So if you see, yeah, little fluffy tail, it's just Marvin. Yeah, my name is Kayla Schwoerer. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Public Administration and Policy. Thank you so much for the invitation, opportunity to contribute to this very important conversation. I'm very excited to be here. So my research looks broadly at sort of public management, nonprofit management, and the use of technology, and specifically digital technologies kind of in those contexts. I'm particularly interested in kind of the citizen side and sort of looking at it from, citizen attitudes, citizens' affects, and whatnot, and how that sort of affects those interactions and relationships. And so we know sort of, broadly that governments are increasingly adopting these algorithmic tools, whether it's sort of, different phases of automation or sort of, more advanced kind of AI or machine learning type of technologies. And these are arguably fundamentally sort of altering how governments are actually interacting with the public and with one another. And so we've seen, these predictive algorithms are being used to prioritize building and health inspections across cities, to flag potential fraud cases for unemployment claims. And while these systems, of course, promise consistency and efficiency, these are decisions that directly impact human lives, right? And decisions that previously required significant time to process, domain expertise, and sort of human judgment to evaluate. And, not to mention that while these systems can process applications faster and more consistently than human bureaucrats, they often operate as black boxes. And so as others have pointed out, this drive for greater efficiency often comes at the cost of these other types of, public and democratic values, such as transparency, accountability, and equity, just to name a few. And those are, the ones that I mainly look at in my research. And so one thing about me is that I am someone who loves a good story. I'm kind of a sucker for a good metaphor or analogy. So I wanted to share one that I think encapsulates the impact of AI in government, many of the issues that are top of mind in discussions about AI in politics, policy, and government, and many that I'm currently examining in my own research. So in April of 2022, the New York Philharmonic performed selections from Fantasia and Fantasia 2000, and I was fortunate enough to be able to attend this. Fantasia was actually one of my favorite movies as a kid, and I'm a bit of a classical music enthusiast as well. So this was, a super cool experience to see, the New York Philharmonic actually play along with scenes from the movie. And of course, one of those selections was The Sorcerer's Apprentice. And while this was supposed to be sort of a nice evening out away from the dissertation writing woes of that time in my life, only moments into that scene, I couldn't help but think about, again, how well it sort of encapsulated a lot of the issues around AI and AI governance that I was, again, looking at in my own research. And so I will say that, I'm not the first to sort of use this story and the original poem that it's based on as a metaphor for things like power and technological innovation and sort of the unintended outcomes. But I do think that it provides a good analogy for the importance of critical perspectives nonetheless. And so if you're not familiar, or it's been a bit of time since you've seen it, in the scene, Mickey Mouse is the apprentice. He's been tasked by the sorcerer with the rather mundane chore of filling a vault with water, bucket by bucket. And so the sorcerer leaves Mickey to complete the task. And in his absence, Mickey spots the sorcerer's hat that he left behind and puts it on, and then proceeds to enchant a broom to do his work for him. And it all seems to be working brilliantly. And so Mickey takes the seat, puts his feet up, and drifts off to sleep, dreaming of what he sees as his sort of newfound power, hat and all. But when he wakes up, he discovers that the vault is overflowing with water as a result of the broom blindly sort of repeating the task over and over again, marching to and from the well, buckets in hand. So in an attempt to stop the broom, Mickey grabs an axe and chops the broom into pieces. However, then the broom transforms into a new broom, and soon there are hundreds of brooms marching in an endless procession, mindlessly carrying water and creating a chaotic flood. And so then it takes, of course, the sorcerer coming back to bring the situation under control. And Mickey appears to learn his lesson about the dangers of sort of wielding power without sufficient understanding or proper controls. And so as I watched this, I thought about sort of the allure of automating routine tasks, the unintended consequences of sort of scaling systems and processes, and especially the reality that when AI and algorithmic systems are wrong, they're wrong at scale, creating sort of cascading errors. And so also, just like the brooms, algorithmic systems are incredibly literal and lack knowledge and understanding of the broader context that human judgment and oversight can best provide. Not to mention sort of how challenging it can be to sort of stop these processes or these technologies once they started, and how quickly these problems within systems, and perhaps most notably within the data that power them, can multiply if left unattended to. And so, there seems to be a similar sense of magical thinking about AI solutions in government. And I think real concern that agencies have unrealistic expectations and sort of insufficient understanding of the systems themselves and their potential consequences. So I think there's this belief that technology can solve complex social and political challenges without actually fully grasping what is actually being set in motion, or sometimes really what's at the root of those problems. And so there's these quick technological fixes rather than really just thoughtful or systematic approaches to AI governance, which may be best. And so as a result, we've seen sort of, these cascading effects of the technical fixes and band-aids, especially to things like algorithmic bias and discrimination, which end up, creating new problems or amplifying existing ones. And then, not to mention the loss of human agency in the situation is especially concerning as well. As both the Fantasia scene and sort of real world examples illustrate, maintaining human oversight and the ability to actually intervene when systems begin producing these unintended consequences can prove extremely difficult and often produce even more harm. And so, this seems rather obvious, and I think many of these things are hardly an original observation. And, and in fact, Virginia, has been at the forefront of a lot of these discussions, and many other scholars are doing some really incredible work, not just calling attention to these risks, but actually informing policy frameworks. And I think this type of work is more important now than ever, because admittedly, we're not in a fairy tale, right? We're actually seeing firsthand how these tools have direct and at times devastating consequences on people's actual lives. But if you allow me to return to the analogy just once more, I do think a question that remains is, who is the sorcerer in all of this, or at least who should fulfill the role of the sorcerer? So put differently, how can we best develop, cultivate, and empower expertise, oversight and accountability mechanisms, and governance frameworks to manage these tools responsibly? And so something I've been thinking a lot about in my own research is sort of the work of media scholars like Neil Postman and his argument about how new technologies are fundamentally reshaping sort of the environments or ecosystems in which they exist. And so, in my case, studying government, I'm really interested in how they're reshaping or fundamentally changing public organizations, systems, and processes, and those interactions between governments and the public that they serve. And so in what ways can this point that we're at in these types of conversations maybe be an opportunity to rethink these organizations, the interactions, and ways to make them more human-centered? I think a lot of that starts with recognizing that none of this is magic. Again, not a fairy tale. And that most importantly, that each of sort of the data points and inputs and outputs actually represent a human and a human experience. And so I'll leave you with that, and I'm looking forward to discussing this further.
All right, well, thank you so much for your presentations and for your time today, Dr. Eubanks, Dr. Kehlenbach, and Dr. Schwoerer. So now we're going to move into the next phase of today's discussion. So for those in the audience who came in a little late, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or use the hand raise function. So while our panelists have been speaking, it looks like the questions have been pouring in. Dr. Novkov is going to get us started first. This question looks like it can be addressed to any of you, so whoever wants it first can go for it. She asks, do you all see anything distinctive about uses of AI versus the concerns you've raised about automation more generally?
Next question is for me, so I'm punting to Kayla and Stefan.
I can sort of answer through almost a non-answer, and I think part of the thing I like to come back to about this is that there's a really unclear definition of like what AI is and how we talk about it. And so in many ways, this question of like automation, like what Virginia's book was talking about when she wrote it, would now be called AI, but like when you were writing it, it wasn't like in the linguistic sort of framework. So the idea of like, oh, there's a clear distinction between what these sort of structures of automation are and what AI is less clear and less sort of defined. And so I think there really is a sort of hazy, murky space in there. And I think one of the things to do is to really recognize that when we say sort of AI, generally speaking, it's really just a marketing term that large corporations use to describe a whole host of different things, from generative AI like ChatGPT and things that make up develop images, to machine learning, to like advanced statistical analyses, to things that operate in the military to sort of develop questions about targeting capabilities for drones and things like that. So there's such a wide category of usages that I think the term AI is almost intentionally being used in a vague way to sort of push a sort of hype futurism that papers over some of these distinctions, right? Because when you talk about the difference between ChatGPT that just sort of spits out text and a sort of very advanced like recommender algorithm or any other thing, you've got a lot of slippage there that people would like to, or like scholars like us would like to disambiguate it. But if you're trying to raise venture capital money, you'd love to squish them all together so people just feel good about your technology. So I think there's not really a huge difference between the distinctive about AI, except from this sort of now we're calling it AI kind of framework. I don't know if.
Yeah. I'm sorry, Kayla, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, that's basically what I was going to say, Stefan, of just like, this, like the sexiness of the term AI and how often that gets conflated with in the government context, like a lot of automated technologies that have been around for a long time. Actually, if you think about like expert systems and sort of the way that those function, not unlike a lot of, what we see now that is now being dubbed AI. I think an example of also, these terms being maybe purposely ambiguous is, the New York City algorithmic register. It has everything on there from like some pretty advanced AI, like, machine learning kind of algorithms to like an Excel like algorithm essentially. And there's not a lot of distinction or guidance to the people that are filling these, forms out to register them. And so, I think that's is potentially an issue, because we need to be more clear, I think, about what we're using and when we're using in what context and the types of impacts that they have. And if we're just sort of using a blanket term, then it makes that very difficult.
So I just want to tell two very fast stories that sort of illustrate what the really great points that Stefan and Kayla have made. So the first one is this idea of math washing, right? Like making something seem more complicated so people don't ask many questions, like is something we see a lot in this field. So the best example I can give of that in my own research is the coordinated entry system, right, was being advertised widely to the public as this like sophisticated set of matching algorithms, like the same as Match.com. When I asked to see this sort of original system, it was a Google spreadsheet, right? It was a guy looking at a Google spreadsheet that was so big that it was crashing the computer systems, right? So like often the way that these tools get talked about in public overestimate the amount of what Mary, whose last name I can't remember right now, it'll come to me, but this amazing woman who won a Genius grant for doing incredible research about what she called ghost work, that there's a lot of human beings that are working really hard, often for very little money, in order to make AI look smart. And that's not going to be the case forever, but it is really important to understand that and to know that it's happening, because we have a way of like erasing human labor, the human labor it takes to actually run artificial intelligence. It's just invisible to most people. The second story, yes, Mary Gray, thank you, Q. She's amazing. I know her well. I just completely forgot her name in the moment. The second story is there was last year, maybe the year before, no, last year, there was an executive order put out by the Biden administration on the safe, secure, and trustworthy development and use of artificial intelligence. 30 to 180 days later, many agencies were sort of grappling with how to implement this executive order, like the Department of Health and Human Services, or the agency that deals with Medicaid and Medicare. And many of them reached out to me to have conversations about like how my work shed light on the sort of implementation challenges that they were facing. And I often told, the stories I always tell that are like my well-researched, well-understood sort of impressions on how automated decision-making was affecting public services in 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19. And at some point, one of the administrators on one of these calls stopped me and was like, yeah. So we understand the issues with automated decision making, but like now we're talking about generative AI. So like, how has everything that you've done before changed? And I said, well, why don't you tell me how the agencies are actually using generative AI, and then we can talk about it. And none of them had anything to say. They were like, we're not using generative AI right now. One of them was like, oh, wait, sometimes we use ChatGPT to summarize policy to tell people what their rights are. And I was like, well, that's the worst possible use of generative AI in your work. Like, please stop doing that, because ChatGPT notoriously gets the intention and the process of legislation wrong, right? But also it's sort of my larger point was like, look, like there's actually 20, 30 years of work on these systems already out there that we can't just throw away because you've stamped AI onto the same basic tools that you were using 5 or 10 years ago. So I think new issues do arise around generative AI. I would fight a little bit with Stefan about the deep fakes, but we can talk about that later. I do think we're seeing real serious effects of deep fakes right now. So there will be new issues, but most of the fundamental struggles, I think, are the same as they were 10 years ago or even 20 years ago. So just some stories.
So it looks like we have 3 questions on our agenda here. So I see we have one from Dinah Refke. I also see Ray Koslowski's hand is raised. I'll go to you after. And then finally, we have a question straight from Ashley's iPhone. So we'll start with Dina's question here. She writes, Virginia, it looks like a mitigating strategy is to change the way programmers build the algorithm so the eligibility criteria is inclusive. Can you elaborate on mitigating strategies?
Yeah, Dina, so thank you so much for that question. There's a lot of attention on how addressing the sort of equity issues in the pipeline to tech might help mitigate some of these problems. I want to say that, of course, that's a good strategy, that, of course, the folks who are designing these really politically consequential tools should look like the larger population, should have a deeper understanding of the issues that different kinds of people face when encountering the systems. But I will also say, I think there's limitations to that strategy. So, and this mostly comes from talking to engineers. And what will happen is I will go talk to engineers about my work, and they almost invariably say, can you give us like a 3 to 5 point plan for like solving all of the huge, like 100-year-old social issues you've just mentioned are being reproduced in these technology systems? And I often would say, like, yeah, I mean, the solution is to like know more about the experience of the people who are your users. And actually, it's not frontline bureaucrats, it's the people who are accessing these programs. Those are your users, so you need to understand their experience. Like understanding a lot more about the history of the policy domain you're working in, right? If you're building a tool for Social Security disability insurance, you better like be talking to folks who have disabilities about what their experience is before you're designing that tool, right? And I'll go on about this list. Like you need to understand the history of the independent living movement if you're gonna understand how these tools might affect. For example, I've done some work on a tool called electronic visit verification, which seems like a very simple update of care workers' timesheets from paper to a cell phone, but actually it uses a technique called geofencing, which means that it constrains the places that people who are giving care can go geographically when they're caring for the person who they work for, and it ends up like actually constraining both the care workers' ability to do their job and the recipient's ability to live a full life. So the independent living movement could have told you that in the 60s, right? So you better know that history. So I'll have these conversations with engineers, and by the point I get to what I've been talking about to you, they start rolling their eyes and they're like, "Oh, it's so hard. Like, just give us 3 points, right? Just tell us the 3 things we can do to make our tools work better." And I think that this is like a major issue around these tools. As Kayla said, there's so much focus on these tools being about efficiency at scale. But the reality is making the tools work in a way that don't reproduce existing inequalities requires working with subpopulations of people. And all of a sudden, all of the savings about working at scale, like creating policy and implementing policy at scale, disappear. And so for me, I think it's a strong argument to just say there are some places that these tools just shouldn't be used at all. And yeah, I know that's controversial, so I'll leave that there. But I do want to be clear to say that, like, I think the pipeline issues are incredibly important, and diversifying our technology workforce is incredibly important, but it's not the only part of the solution.
Real quick, I could also make it more complicated too, which is my favorite thing to do, which is to bring up some of my sort of theoretical issues with these questions. When we talk about these questions of inclusivity or things, a lot of times we're talking about development of things like AI ethics or questions about just technologies without a real clear theoretical understanding of what we mean by ethics or by justice or about inequality. Like what kinds of things are we trying to achieve in the world? How are we going to do this? Especially when you look at it from a purely consequentialist viewpoint of what is the outcome or the consequence of using these technologies. And as technology scholars for literally decades have been pointing out, there's no way to figure out what the consequence of an action is. Like, that's a Hannah Arendt's problem with politics generally, not to be super theoretical, but it's what I do. Is how, if you're just saying, oh, well, the consequence of this technology has to be good. Well, tomorrow, in 5 years, in 10 years, in a century, how are we grappling with these sort of questions? And knowing what we're trying to do requires not only, I think, as Virginia is saying, a deep understanding of like the population, but a deep understanding of like theoretically, what are you trying to do? What do you mean by justice when you think that this technology should be just? Are we like how these are questions that have been essentially unanswered for thousands of years. Like you can't simply come in and be like, oh, well, I can program an AI to be just without grappling with the question. Well, like we don't really know what a just society is today. How are we going to distill that down into a simple bit of code? So I think being really attentive to all of these points where when you take a technical system and you interact it with humans, you end up with this sort of the fuzziness of human experience that really is not something to be overcome, but is something to be sort of grappled with and embraced within a holistic way.
I just want to give like a really concrete example of what Stefan is talking about. A lot of the misunderstandings that happen inside communities that are designing and using these technologies is misunderstanding around what equity is. So there are lots of people who are designing and using these technologies who see equity as treating all like cases alike. And there are a lot of other people who see equity as working towards more equal outcomes for everyone. And those are really like, those are operationalized really differently. So the folks who see it as like cases alike are like, everybody gets treated exactly the same. That's something tech is really good at doing. Like we're just going to shove all individual experience through this very limited algorithm. The folks who believe that equity is working towards more equal outcomes might argue, for example, that there always have to be humans in the loop because there are cases that won't make sense for this statistical tool that aligns itself with the norm and doesn't do very well with the edges, right? So that's a perfect example, right? It's like, well, what do you mean when you say equity is a conversation that we don't really have as often as we should in this field.
All right, so we can pass it over to Ray now. The floor is yours.
Okay, yeah, I have a question for Stefan regarding the secret sauce of political campaigning that you had mentioned. And I remember after the 2016 campaign, learning about how I guess was Facebook, and there might have been some other companies that had employees embedded in the Trump campaign to help them use the technology, and of course was offered, to the Clinton campaign as well, but not utilized. Um, and just after reading the New York Times Magazine article, yesterday's New York Times Magazine, about Elon Musk and the tech bros who have been increasingly funding the Trump campaign. And from what I understand, one of the things that Musk is particularly focused on is on the outsourced canvassing. So whereas the Democratic Party has deployed a whole lot of canvassers, volunteers, etc., the Trump campaign didn't get its ground game. It's basically outsourced this to people that Musk and others are paying for. So with that said, I'm wondering, is there any evidence that there are similarly embedded AI experts from technology companies involved in this outsourced canvassing operation or any other parts of the Trump campaign, as it was the case back in 2016?
Yeah, I unfortunately I did not read that. I'll have to look up that the New York Magazine article, or maybe you can email it to me.
Yeah.
Uh, I'm a bit behind on all of my news making as
Well,
a small child in my house, and it's made it
yeah,
difficult to do all of these things.
but the main point, and it was talking about Thiel and of course JD Vance and all of the venture capitalist money that has been going, and how there's been a shift in the campaign contributions to the Trump camp, and also the outsourcing of the ground game, which has been covered extensively elsewhere as well. But that's the main thing. I'm just wondering about.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I can definitely see the idea, and I think I've heard. I mean, goes back to like the way that like even the Obama campaign in 2008 was able to use data very effectively to like do voter targeting
Mhm.
for canvassing. And if you've done any canvassing, they usually give you an app and you sort of go around and like have all of that.
Mhm.
So I can see AI tools being used in this way. I mean, I
Mhm.
think my general point is we tend to see those things come out after the campaign is over, right?
Right.
That's when everybody writes their books or like comes out and does these things, and not less when campaigns tend to be quite tight-lipped about that when they are doing the campaign. To your second point, I do think it's been very interesting to see almost the like Silicon Valley flip in terms of
Mhm.
it used to be a place where lots of Democrats got lots of funding for campaigns, and now with Thiel and Musk and everybody are all sort of pushing more towards sort of candidates, particularly Trump. My initial instinct is simply that this is a classic story of regulation and wanting regulatory capture. Like these, they're seeing for the first time that at least Democratic politicians are interested in regulating and managing AI or other sort of data centers and these sort of other things, and they're looking to escape this sort of regulatory capture. I'm not going to pretend to know what's going on in Elon Musk's brain because that's a terrifying place. But I think that's generally where they're pushing is they want sort of freedom from regulation, and so they're seeing that as being mostly achievable um, through a Trump administration. But yeah, I think one of the things we'll see is how and in what sense is AI being used in campaigning, and especially in the sort of outsourced campaigning that's happening. Are we seeing? Is it like machine learning data sets of like, oh, this voter is persuadable on these particular issues. So if you knock on their door and talk to them about X, Y, or Z, then they might be more willing to vote for you, or they might be willing to be mobilized to vote. Or is it like, here we'll use ChatGPT to generate talking points for you? Like I think there's probably some of that going on inside of the like the lower level sort of campaign
Mhm.
stuff. Um, but I haven't seen a lot of it. And then I think just to defend my point against Virginia about deepfakes real quick, I was mostly talking about, no, I really do think, I think deepfakes are a fascinating and difficult issue. I was just there in the run up to the campaign, there was a lot of talk about, well, we're going to see a lot of like deepfakes of Biden saying something really like inflammatory or things like that. And it was sort of surprising to me that we haven't seen more of that, and that it's been more in this political cartoony thing versus like there's going to be real problems with deepfakes in terms of, I think, just like testimonial evidence being undercut. Um, I
Yeah,
think those are separate issues.
like Barack Obama calls it this epistemological crisis of not knowing what the
Yeah.
truth is, right? Like, because we're going to see this deep fake of Kamala Harris saying something crazy, right? Like,
Mhm.
I think I absolutely agree with you on that, but I want to sort of maintain, like, I want to avoid the math washing, right? So, like, let's
Yeah.
look at the really banal cases, like the really boring cases, actually, that aren't sexy and don't have the shiny tech veneer to them, are incredibly consequential. So, I think the most important example of this right now is the girl with the puppy in the boat during Hurricane Helene image, right? So this is an image that was produced by AI. It wasn't a real image of a little girl wearing a life jacket in a boat, seems alone, clutching a puppy and sort of crying during Hurricane Helene. And this has become like a huge talking point, particularly on the right, about failures of public agencies to respond adequately and effectively to people suffering. And this has been a huge issue for FEMA in the last several disasters because they've had to remove field crews because people have been threatening and doing violence to their frontline workers. So there have been, like a lot of threats of gun violence against FEMA workers in the last year or so. And much of that is tied directly to this kind of sometimes AI produced disinformation, right? So I don't think the AI is the star player. I think there's a bigger picture here about disinformation and the ways we understand governance. But I do think, like, to ignore that there are these images that have been produced by artificial intelligence, or I think are having really big consequences on politics generally, and also on individual human beings and communities. Like, I think it would be a mistake to not pay attention to that.
All right, so we have our next question from Ashley. This is a follow-up question from the one that Dina Arefki asked earlier. So she's curious for specific examples about how automation of public services is disproportionately harmful to the most vulnerable. So she writes that my experience studying the Medicaid unwinding suggests that the most vulnerable, i.e. those whose addresses and phone numbers change frequently, were best served by automated ex parte renewal, at least in states that were committed to doing this. The political leadership and their desire to use these tools to mitigate harms seem to be the more important factor. Can these tools help the most vulnerable at the end of the day?
So I'm thrilled to hear that. I'd love to talk more about what you're finding. I'll give like a specific example of the point I made, though. So in the oral history work that Andrea and I have been doing in Spain, I talked to a man who goes by the name Carlos in the book. And Carlos was receiving a small local benefit that was, he works as like a scrap recycler. So he sort of gathers things that other people have discarded, and he sorts them and gets them to people who buy them, and that's how he supports his family. And he also received a small amount of money from the city that he lives in, from the local government of the city that he lives in. Now, during the pandemic, Spain passed, I'm not going to be able to come up with the name of it right now, but they basically passed a basic minimum income that was available to everyone under a certain income point in all of Spain. So it's a really huge political victory. And potentially could sort of do away with some of the means testing that often makes automated systems more complicated than they need to be. It's like, if you're under X line, like, you get money, it shows up in your account. Like, you'll hear about it on your cell phone, it'll show up in your account 2 days later. And it worked really well for lots of people who were pretty well off. But folks like Carlos kept getting stuck in these impossible situations where the city benefit that he was getting judged the size of the was based on your household, so everyone who lives in your physical space with you. The federal benefit was based on family, so everyone who is related to you, who you're living with. The two definitions clashed, and what that meant is he no longer got he was living in a multi-generational household, so he had a complicated household. This is the thing that put him on the margin. He basically, the local benefit that he was getting would not distribute benefits for folks who were eligible for the federal program, but the federal program did not count him as eligible because of his household composition. So he ended up losing both, right? And lived 3 years through the pandemic with no income coming in to his household at all. Like, it was an incredibly difficult situation. So it's these kinds of just sort of outlier experiences, right? He lives in a big multi-generational household. That means he's outside the norm, and the system just broke for him, and it broke with really serious consequences for him and other people like him. So that'd be an example.
All right, so we will go to what might be our last question today in the time we have allotted. It's a super fun one here from Mark Ballooney. He asks, what connections, if any, do you see between AI and Big Brother, e.g. the brainwashing, the increasingly divided social news media, and the current national election campaigns, including related ads? So what's the connection between AI and Big Brother, if any? Does this analogy work?
I could hop in and maybe take an initial stab at this one too. I think that actually what has become more interesting is I think that the the metaphor is slightly different. I think we're less in a Big Brother situation and more in sort of like a Brave New World situation, to pull our different technological science fiction dystopias together. Just in the fact that in the main point of Big Brother is of 1984 and Orwell is like overt state power exerted very visibly on individuals as a way to sort of keep them in line in a way that they would not ordinarily be sort of operating. And whereas the Brave New World question is sort of a more softer dystopia of managing and sort of like managing and manufacturing complicity through sort of soft power ways. I think that's closer to where we are, right? When you look, and especially in this question of like, how does social media operate? It operates through recommender algorithms. It operates by showing you what you want to see or what it predicts that you will want to click on or you'll want to view. And it does things like very sophisticated, like analysis of what things and how long you stay on particular pages, how your mouse moves when you're on a website, or what you click on when you're using the YouTube app, or where you are when you do these things. And so it's very much a sort of managing and sort of framing this through not only a private organization, but through a sort of soft recommender framing of this in a way, and in ways that are oftentimes not even seen as like oppressive or pushed. I know there's a researcher named Chris Gilliard who works on this, who talks and coined the term luxury surveillance, which is the idea that many of the things that, rather than surveillance being seen as something done to an underclass or something that, while that of course absolutely happens, increasingly we're seeing surveillance being pitched as a luxury item, right? You talk about your Amazon Alexas, your Roombas, your Ring cameras. These are things that are pitched not as a way of monitoring an underclass, but as a luxury item that is a status symbol that is nevertheless feeding into the surveillance operation. So we've got this sort of dual nature. And I think one of the bigger things is when we think about it in terms of, I mean, I think Big Brother is like the classic place we go to, but I think when we do that, we go, oh, well, we're not seeing a sort of oppressive state power that's doing this, so we don't have any problems. But it's in the more sort of subtle management and framing of choices and understandings that sort of push us in that direction. And I think that's the better place to think about. Like, what is it to live in a place where everything is recommended to you rather than as a sort of exploration and framing out in these ways? Like, we can go our whole lives now without ever seeing something that we don't want to see, or somebody has decided that we don't want to see. We listen to recommended playlists on Spotify. We watch recommended videos on YouTube. Netflix tells us what to watch next. We exist in this sort of moderated existence in this little way. I think that's the question. So that's where you end up in these questions of like political discourse bubbles and questions like that of how do we sort of manage our differing sort of political and cultural existence.
All right, well, we can wrap up here. I think that the number of high quality questions we got today is just a testament to how engaging each of your presentations were. So thank you to our panelists, and thank you to our audience members so much